Greetings! My name is Ev, and today I am very excited about this. This is something that I had never heard of before, and I think it is super interesting. What is it, you're gonna ask? Well, it is this new type of paper. These are from the brand Ohuhu, and even though the packaging is pretty much exactly the same, one is hot press, one is cold press, and it is a different type of watercolor paper that has a cellulose base and a cotton top layer. So basically you're painting on cotton, but the whole paper isn't cotton, so that makes it more affordable. And I was immediately intrigued, and I am so curious to try these out, and I will get to it right away, and I will come back to you guys with all sorts of swatches and tests and my thoughts on this paper. So let's go! Before I show you the results of my test, I will list all the parameters of my tests. Of course, the paper I'll be using is the one that I'm reviewing, so the 2 pads of Wailua cotton top paper from Ohuhu in cold press and hot press. For all the tests, I used distilled water, and I use 2 colors from Roman Schmal. One is a granulating black. It is the Aquarius black color, made from pigment PBK11, and the second color is a smooth black. It is velvet black, made from a mix of PR264 and PG7. For the lifting test, I used a scrubbing brush from Rosemary & Co. It is their small The Eradicator brush. For the masking test, I used 3 materials. I used a painter's tape from Scotch, the blue tape. I used a washi tape from MT, the yellow one, and I used masking fluid from Holbein. It's their white and green label, but I put mine in a fine line applicator. For the smudging test, I used 5 pencils and pens. So I used a Caturdays sketcher, which is a non-photo blue pencil. I used regular 0.5 HB graphite lead in a mechanical pencil. Then I used a standard Bic ballpoint pen. I used a fine liner from Faber-Castell Pitt with black ink in size 0.3. And finally, I used a Pentel pocket brush pen. Usually these are all black. Mine is a special edition, that's why it has a pattern on it. For the eraser, I use a Pentel Ain eraser, the one with the red label. And lastly, for all of these tests, I used a very basic, cheap brush with synthetic hair. I don't think the brush I'm using is particularly relevant for these tests. It's more about having the right size for the area I'm trying to cover, but for all of the tests, I used just a very basic, cheap synthetic bristle brush. Like last time, I'll put on this side a little window with the process of me painting the test I'm talking about. But yeah, it's the same tests, it's the same sort of layout. So the first one here is the layering test. We are on the cold pressed paper and with the granulating paint, so the Aquarius black. And I might have made my third wash a bit too light, but still the paint's layered well, and it's really interesting to layer granulating paint like this, but I didn't have any issue with this. That worked out perfectly well. Then this is the lifting test with just water. The first pass is just I put down water, I don't touch it. Here is I put down water and then I scrub once, and here I put down water and I scrub back 3 times. So I scrub and I pick up the paint and the water with paper towel. I wet it again, scrub again, pick it up again 3 times. So it removed a significant amount of pigment, not quite back to white of the paper, but I've not seen a lot of paint that will let you go back to the white of the paper. This is wet in wet, so pretty much what you'd expect. It makes for a really beautiful diffusion pattern, I feel like, with a paint that's such heavily granulating. It's a bit like halftone. Then the dry brushing, also pretty much what I would expect. Since I used the paint a bit more dry, you don't really see the granulation, but it's really easy to pick up on the texture of the paper here. This test here, I did something a bit different for this one, and you will see. But this is the masking test. So the first stripe you see here, that's painter's tape, the same blue tape that I used everywhere. In the middle, it's washi tape, and the third one is masking fluid. And if you look at the way that I set up the test, there's kind of a little box here to the side. So I made that with the intent of testing what it's like to paint over the area that had the masking fluid. So I have here on the edge here, I have my masking fluid area, and in the middle here, like it was like a little box, so I had a piece of untouched paper in the middle, then the masking fluid around it, and then the rest of the test. So what I did is I simply painted over this whole area to see if I would get a weird behavior from the paper in the spot where there was masking fluid. I hope that makes sense. But for the granulating color, I don't see anything special. Again, I will reiterate that my masking fluid leaves this sort of yellow cast on paper. It's possible it's a bit old. Then I have the smudging test. The first section here is with the finger, so I just smudged with my finger, and it seems like, again, it's the graphite that makes the bigger mess. The non-photo blue pencil doesn't seem to smudge a lot. Ballpoint pen didn't smudge, the fine liner didn't smudge, and the brush pen also didn't smudge. With the eraser, well, it picked up the two pencils and nothing different on the inks. With the plain water this time, I used water that was completely untouched, and I can see a little bit of a cast, very faint cast. So it's possible that there's one of my testers in here that gets picked up a little bit with the water and the scrubbing that I did, but it is a really faint mark. I would be hard-pressed to say which one is responsible for it because they all look pretty much the same. If I was to use one on a bigger piece, I would perhaps do a series of tests to see who's the culprit. And then finally with a bit of the granulating paint, and there's really nothing unusual here. The two at the bottom are an even wash to the best of my abilities and a gradated wash to the best of my abilities. It is extra difficult to do with such a heavily granulating paint, but I feel like the paper behaves perfectly well here, and any kind of patchiness or blemishes is entirely the paint and user error. Overall, an excellent performance from this paper so far. So I will go through these again, same order as before. The first square is our layering square, and it's quite interesting if you compare both. You definitely see the difference of texture in the paper. Now, people sometimes assume that hot press means you won't get that really nice granulation, but it's not true. In reality, the main difference is that cold press already has a sort of repetitive texture to it, and it will help guide the heavier particle to settle in a sort of predictable way. With hot press, you don't have that. So it is more difficult to handle, but you may get a lot more unexpected effects from using granulating paints on hot press because you can't really predict how it's gonna settle, basically. But back to my layer test. So again, we can see 3 layers. My third one is perhaps a little bit light, but that's user error, so apologies for that. There's really nothing unusual that happened when layering paint on this paper. Next one is our lifting test. So here we see a little bit more of a difference with just the water first pass, the scrub ones pass. They look a bit similar, but the scrubbed one, since I actively scrubbed the paint, you get a bit more of a hard edge, and it is sort of more fuzzy where I scrubbed the paint, while here it is lighter, but I didn't perturb the particles of the paint, so it looks like the same texture, just lighter. And then this one I scrubbed a few times, 3 times, and I got the paper back to quite light, but not completely white. Next one is the wet in wet. So we have a little bit of that unpredictability that I mentioned at the beginning with this test because the way the pigment settled was not guided by the texture of the paper. It basically did whatever. And that's kind of why I think I ended up with such a abstract shape here. Whereas the cold press texture is much more controlled. You have a darker color at the point where I dropped the most pigment, and what was able to spread out before settling made for this sort of gradient effect. Here it's a bit more chaotic. Dry brushing on this paper also worked quite well. You don't have the texture of the paper to make for your dry brushing, but if your brush is dry enough, you can still get that grungy kind of texture to it. Next, we have the masking test. So painter's tape did well, washi tape did well, the masking fluid removed cleanly as well. And again, I did my little box to the side to test the area that had masking fluid. You can sort of see the ghost of the area where I put the masking fluid here. The granulation of the paint hides it well, but it's faintly there if you know it's there. And again, the yellow tint is because of my masking fluid. For the smudging test, same thing again. So first is the finger, and it feels like it's lighter, like there's less smudging than on the cold press paper, which would make sense because of the fact that the other one is textured. So it's possible that while doing my lines, the rougher texture picked up more graphite. So when I smudged, there was more for me to smudge. Both pencils erased really well here again. The ink didn't move. My my just water wash is again a very faint gray. This is a little droplet that came from this one and landed here, so don't mind that. But there is still that little faint box of very, very lightly gray paint. So there's definitely one of these that loses a little bit of its ink or its graphite as I scrub over it with water, but it's very, very faint. And then the paint worked out perfectly fine. And then we have the even wash and the gradated wash. Again, I did the best I could. It's not easy to do an even wash with such a granulating paint on hot press. There's nothing that will disseminate the pigment but your brush strokes and where you put the water. So it was a bit difficult, but I think it makes for a really interesting texture regardless. And kind of the same for the gradient wash, but we can still see the gradient. It is definitely a bit darker here and then progressively gets lighter. So it is kind of there. So these are the two papers with the granulating paint. We can definitely see a big difference between these. The texture of the cold press paper is very easy to notice throughout all the painted areas with the granulating paint. On the hot press surface, the smoother surface, you don't have that sort of pattern throughout everything, but you still get that granulation from the paint. So there's really a lot of room here for exploring and for making paintings that have a bit more of that uncontrolled chaos thrown in. And now it is time to take a look at the smooth color, starting with the cold press paper again. So the layering part of the test is pretty much what you'd expect. I still have a bit of that hard line here. I don't think it's something that is from the paper. I think that's entirely user sourced. But yeah, we definitely have our 3 layers here and it seems to have layered perfectly fine. So no real issue there. For the scrubbing test or the lifting test, so the first one where I just put the water, you don't see anything. Well, I don't see anything. Then for the scrub once, you can see that I picked up a little bit of the pigment. And then for the scrub 3 times, I removed more of the pigment, but there's still a substantial amount that is left on the paper. This smooth black is more of a staining color, so that's possibly why. There doesn't seem to be any pilling or any change to the paper whatsoever. Then I have the wet in wet test here. So the paint being more smooth, it's spread out more and we don't have as much of a dark center to the patch of paint than we did with the granulating color. But you can see that the paint traveled a fair amount in the wet area. And even though it is a smooth paint, you still see the texture of the paper. And then for dry brushing, it worked out well. Cold press paper is relatively easy to do dry brush on because it already has that texture. All you need is a brush that is dry enough. For the masking test, so the painter's tape and the washi tape both removed really nice and clean. The masking fluid also removed nice and clean. It left its yellow cast there, of course, but where it gets interesting is in the little side box here. We definitely see a difference between the area that had the masking fluid and the area that was just paper. So you really have that line here, that separation. What this means is that if you plan to use more of a smooth color, more transparent colors, more staining colors, and masking fluid on this paper, well, I mean, there's an easy fix to this. All you have to do is fill up the whole area with a thin layer of masking fluid. At least then, when you remove it, the whole area where the mask was will behave in the same way. You won't have a weird outline effect. For the smudging test, so the first part again is smudging with my finger, so there's a little bit of like pigment that was picked up from the graphite mostly, but also a little bit of the blue. Again, eraser, the 2 pencils erased well and the ink didn't move. With the plain water, it is basically the same result again, so a very faint gray cast to the wet area, and then with the paint, it also laid on top of my lines with no issue whatsoever. And then for the even wash, I think it's worked out pretty well. And then the gradient, my gradient is a little bit split in sections. That's again user error, but I feel like you can still see just how it would work to make gradients on this paper if you are a bit more careful about it. There's a really good dark mass tone and it dilutes to a nice lighter gray, so I think that works out. And this is the smooth color on the smooth paper. So the hot press texture with the smooth color, it layered fine. The little hard line is a bit more visible here, but it's not something that comes from the paper. It's something that comes from the paint or from the painter. For the lifting test, so here we see the plain water removed a little bit of the paint. The scrubbing once removed more of it, fair enough, and then the scrubbing 3 times removed a decent amount of pigment, but again, we don't get back to full white of the paper. There doesn't seem to be any changes in the texture of the paper where I lifted the paint. The wet in wet here is very similar to the one from the cold press paper, so the smooth color was a bit more diffuse and really traveled more in the water. As you can see, it followed like along the edges of the tape and all of that, and since it's not as heavy in terms of pigment particle as the granulating color, well, it can go further away. So there's that. For the dry brushing, so dry brushing with a smooth color on hot press is a bit more difficult. You can still do it, but it's going to give you sort of a more even like main area, and then when you sort of lift off paper, that's when you get a bit more texture, but it's still pretty smooth if you compare to the cold press texture. For the masking test, here we see again that the two tapes did a very good job. The masking fluid also removed cleanly on the edges, but we still have that area that indicates where the masking fluid was when I painted over it. So it's another one of those things where you have to be a bit careful, or you just have to cover the whole masked area with a thin layer of masking fluid to make sure that your paper surface underneath is going to be nice and even. For the smudging, with the finger, I don't think we see much of anything. There's a faint, really faint sort of gray where I smudge it with my finger, but it's kind of hard to notice. Then with the eraser, it erased cleanly and the paper seems to be pretty much intact underneath. Plain water, again, that little gray cast, and then the paint, pretty much standard. So far, none of the tests that I've done on any of the papers seem to have affected the texture of the paper itself. I didn't get any pilling, I didn't get any lifted fibers. I think the only moment when I get lifted fibers is when I removed the border tape, but I haven't really noticed any difference of texture in any of the paper, whether it is the erasing or the lifting. The very last test on this sheet, it's the even wash and the gradient wash. I tried my best. It wasn't very easy to do a super smooth, even layer. You can tell that there was some sort of water movement from the way this area dried, and here too, I have a bit of a halo going. And then the gradient, also, you have a little bit of a background here, and areas a bit uneven, but this feels entirely due to user error and not to paper problems. So I'm confident that with more practice and if I'm a bit more careful, I would be able to get a really nice gradient on this paper. So these are the two tests with the smooth paint. So cold press paper is the first one, hot press paper is the second one. As you can see, the differences we get between the papers are pretty much what you would expect from a paper that is cold press and one that is hot press. It's a really interesting performance, especially for the hot press, because smooth paper and smooth paint, it is extra hard to handle, but it is also really fun to work with because you get sort of unexpected, chaotic things going. And then I did the test where I cut the paper in four, this, and I alternate front of the paper, back of the paper, front of the paper, back of the paper, and then I do granulating paint on one side, smooth paint on the other, even washes at the top, gradient washes at the bottom, and that gives me an idea for how the back of the paper handles the paint compared to the front of the paper. Apologies if these washes and gradients are not that great. I tried using a bigger brush for these, and turns out it fits better in terms of size to paint, but it's much more difficult to handle. So I did what I could, but keep in mind that someone that is perhaps more skilled with larger brushes would get much better results here. With the cold press, so we can kind of see that the back of the paper has a different texture than the front of the paper, especially with the smooth paint, because the granulating paint is so granulating that I would be a little bit hard pressed to see a difference between the two of them. With all that's happening, it's difficult to see, but here, since the paint is smoother, we can see the difference a bit better. And for the hot press, I feel like there's a little bit less of a difference between the front and the back of the paper. So I will say one of the main elements that I noticed that was very dramatically different from the front and the back of the paper is how it handled the tape. So here, this is the front of the paper, this is where I had the tape, and you can see that it lifted some of the fibers, but not a lot. But look at the back of the paper. So hopefully that will be visible, but the back of the paper doesn't like masking tape at all. It lifted up so many fibers, and I didn't expect that. At first I thought it could be like user error, but there is such a drastic change as soon as we switch side of the paper when I remove the tape. So the first segment that's on the front of the paper is, decent, and then the back of the paper is a mess. And then we return to the front of the paper, which is nice again, and then the back is also a mess. So there's definitely something about the back of the paper that doesn't do masking tape well, but for everything else, it's definitely a surface you can use. Now, I would just use the front of the paper if it came to it, but it's nice to know that the back of the paper can also be used for painting. So that's it for my tests and sort of first impressions of this hybrid paper. I think this is a really interesting middle ground between a more affordable paper while having a good quality surface to work with. I'm really looking forward to working more with this paper, how it compares to full cotton paper or full cellulose paper. I want to say a big thank you to Ohuhu for sending me these to try out. I think this is a really fun idea, and I'm really looking forward to first using them more, but also seeing what other people do with these. Also, a big thank you to you guys for watching this video. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you learned or enjoyed anything in particular in this video. I'll have all the links in the description if you want to look at these pads for yourself. Until the next video, take care. Bye bye.